Charlie, any idea what today's episode is about?
I don't know.
It's elementary, my dear Charlie. Welcome to Apple Core, a podcast about the history of Apple. In each episode, we travel back in time to explore the story behind a different Apple product and consider what it tells us about where the company may be heading next. I'm Graham Bauer, a designer, writer, and long-time Apple user.
And I'm Charlie Sorrell, and I still haven't come up with a good profile for myself.
A man of many talents.
I'm sorry.
If you'd like to support the show, you can do that by checking out our brand new merch store on TeePublic. We've got t-shirts, sweatshirts, hoodies, tote bags, mugs, and more, featuring retro geek designs by yours truly. And you can access it via our brand new website, applecorepod.com. I'd like to thank one of our listeners, Marcus Chow, who suggested our topic for this episode. And by the way, if you have a suggestion for an episode topic that you want to drop us a line and suggest, then you can do that also on our website, applecorepod.com. And Marcus suggested for this episode that we talk about Sherlock, which I thought was an interesting topic, Charlie, because I think it's one of Apple's most misremembered products. What do you remember about Sherlock? What was Sherlock?
I remember it. It changed. It was a way of searching for things on your computer, but then it turned into a way to search the internet that wasn't just using a web browser, and it would collate different kinds of information for you. It would pull like videos together and pictures together and other things together. And it was actually quite a useful research tool. I quite liked it. And I also liked the thing that they copied, which I'm sure you're going to mention.
Maybe we'll have a little argument about that later. So, as you say, Charlie, Sherlock was the tool Apple provided to search for files on your Mac. It shipped with macOS 8.5 in 1998, and it featured advanced search features that Steve Jobs had harvested from the carcass of Apple's failed next-generation operating system, Copeland. And for the first time, it enabled Mac users to search content within the files, not just search on the file names. Later versions of Sherlock introduced a concept of modular channels, enabling users to integrate search results from custom data types, a feature that proved to be similar to an indie app that, Charlie, you alluded to. What was the name of that app?
That was Watson.
That was Watson, indeed. As a search engine, Sherlock today is all but forgotten, but its name lives on as a verb, to Sherlock, which is used to describe, well, Charlie, what is it to Sherlock something?
So sherlocking became the term to refer to any time that Apple added a feature which made an app obsolete. That's it. That's sherlocking.
So it's when Apple makes a third-party app obsolete by integrating or bundling similar functionality into the Mac OS, or I guess these days iOS as well.
Yeah. Although I would argue that it's not necessarily a bad thing. It could be beneficial in some ways.
We'll put a pin on that because I think it's an interesting discussion, and we're definitely going to get into all of that later on in the episode. So before we get started, Charlie, as is our tradition, I have some teaser questions for you.
Yes.
Are you poised and ready?
Always ready for quizzes.
Okay, so question 1. What is SGML? So let's start with the tricky ones.
I don't know this one, but I'm going to guess. Sherlock, general... I don't know. I was going to say machine learning, but that was way before machine learning was a thing.
You got generalized is the G, and I think I might have tricked you here because I'm sort of asking this out of context, but its relevance will become apparent. So SGML is standard generalized markup language.
Oh, of course, ML, markup language. Yeah, HTML. Duh.
So SGML is a family of languages which emerged in the late 80s. The most famous version of SGML that we would all be familiar with is XML. And something which is the cousin of SGML is today's HTML. But basically, SGML is a kind of markup language, which is a way of marking up data. And SGML is what Sherlock used as the language for its plugins. So we're going to come back to SGML a bit later. I've got 2 more questions for you. You ready?
Yes.
Next question. What is a Boolean operator?
A Boolean operator is like and, or, and not. So if you're doing a search, you could search for all the files with Graham in the title, but not with
Charlie
in the title. Yeah, for instance.
Graham, not Charlie. What an excellent example of a Boolean operator.
Yeah.
And final one, before we get into the show, Charlie, how would you describe a web service?
A web service?
Yeah.
I don't know. I would think of it in 2 ways. One, it could be a local application that presents information from the web in a custom interface, or something which runs on the web. Well, that would be everything. Every app that we use these days is kind of a web view.
The idea of web services emerged in the late 90s. Rather than just having web servers serving web pages to web browsers, the idea was using the HTTP protocol to actually communicate between servers. So you could provide data in response to a request from another server. Steve Jobs described Sherlock 3 as internet services for the rest of us, which is a very Steve Jobs type quote. Yeah. So we'll get into that when we get to Sherlock 3. So are you ready to get into it, Charlie? Are you all set?
I'm ready.
Okay, setting the scene, as we like to do. The year is 1998. Will Smith was getting jiggy with it. Aerosmith didn't want to miss a thing. And one of my personal favourites, Janet Jackson wanted to be together again. On TV, Sex and the City and Will and Grace had premiered. And the movies were all about the apocalypse with Armageddon and Deep Impact.
Wait, Sex and the City and Will and Grace came out the same year?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. I thought Will and Grace was a lot later.
Steve Jobs was working at Apple. He'd returned 1 year earlier in 1997, but he didn't yet have the CEO title or even the interim CEO title, which he later took. He was just working there as a consultant. But there was no doubt in anyone's mind that he was the de facto ruler of Apple after he'd ousted the former CEO, Gil Amelio. It was a time of great upheaval for Apple. But as became clear, it was also a transformative time that would set up Apple to become the behemoth that it is today. And as evidenced by that, despite all the many projects like Newton that Steve Jobs scrapped during this period, one of the real positives for Apple fans like myself back in the late 90s was Steve Jobs returned Apple's focus to the Mac. And I think it had been distracted away from the Mac by stuff like the Newton and all kinds of other things. They were no longer sticking to their knitting. The Mac platform had languished on System 7 for years, and it had just become dated. But on Steve Jobs' return, one of the things that he did was he went through all of the crap that Apple had been working on in the 90s and had never shipped to look for the good stuff. So as I mentioned in the intro, Apple had worked on this failed Copeland operating system that was supposed to be the next generation operating system for the Mac. And they never managed to get it to work, but it did have some really cool features. Steve Jobs and his team went through Copeland and picked out the good bits that they could use. One of the things which we talked about before, Charlie, in our episode on macOS 8 was the beautiful Platinum user interface. And another was the underlying search technologies that were part of Copeland, which became Sherlock. And so that's what we're looking at today. Before we get into how that happened, I wanted to take a moment to just think about search itself, because I think one of the interesting things here is there's one company that particularly, I guess, comes to mind these days when we say search, which is Google, right? Yeah. So when we think about search now, I think the first thing we think about is web search. But there is also, I guess it's less sexy, but there's searching for files on your computer as well. And from a technology perspective, they're much the same thing. The way that this works is you build an index. It takes a long time to construct the index, but then that index enables the search result to be returned much faster. So if you have 1,000 files on your computer, then if the search was going to search through all those 1,000 files, to look for a word, it would take a long time. But if you already searched through those 1,000 files and created a much smaller index of just the keywords, then the search can be much faster. Yeah. That principle of having an index is just the same as what Google is doing, is exactly the same as what Spotlight is doing on your Mac or your iPhone. And back in the day, Sherlock was doing as well, that it has to build this index. And one of the things that you'll often see an issue with indexing on the Mac is the daemon that does the indexing is called MD Worker. It's the MDS metadata server. And I was Googling MD Worker as I was researching this episode. And whenever you look up MD Worker as a keyword on Google,
let me guess.
The first thing
it's using way too much CPU or too much memory.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. It's all that anyone talks about. And I think this is indicative of that legwork that we were talking about, of doing the work up front to build the index so the search results can then be returned instantly. In the 90s, that was a new technology. This was all quite new stuff. So the first internet search engine to emerge, and this I found fascinating because we still use it today, is Whois. You can use Whois in the command line if you ever use the terminal app, and you can type in Whois and type in a domain name, and it will give you like the DNS information for that domain. That actually predates even the web, way back. Can you guess when Whois was created, Charlie?
Oh, I don't know. Maybe the 60s?
Not far off. The first Whois server was set up by information scientist Elizabeth Feinler at Stanford University in the early 70s. And the Whois service we know and use today was standardized in the early 80s. Also, before the web, do you remember Archie and Gopher?
Yeah, I can't remember what they do. All I know is I remember their names, but that's it.
So Archie, which I think was short for archive, was a tool that let you search FTP shares. It's funny to think now that we're so used to the web, but one of the early ways in which you'd browse information on the internet before the web was you'd log into an FTP server, and then you could use Archie to search for what you were interested in, and then it would bring up a document from that FTP server. And Gopher came out in 1991, and it allowed you to search documents as well. So in the early 90s, search was a much cruder thing than it is today. And in fact, in 1991, there was no search feature in the macOS at all. So you couldn't search for files on your computer. That, as an idea, didn't exist.
It seems insane.
I know, it's amazing. Obviously, then, as the 90s progressed, search engines like Excite, Google, Webcrawler, and Hotbot.
Hotbot.
Do you remember Hotbot? It belonged to Wired, as I recall.
Yeah, Hotbot. Yeah, these names, though. I mean, Hotbot, and then earlier you were talking about Deep Impact. It doesn't seem... It seems like another part of the internet.
But the thing is that in these early days of the web, indexing wasn't particularly good, so it didn't always return great search results. So I guess wasn't considered the only way to do this. So Yahoo was actually a directory rather than a search engine. Mm-hmm. And so it was entirely human curated. So websites would be manually added into a directory, and you would search this directory rather than searching the internet.
That seems impossible. I mean, how much smaller the internet must have been to make that even...
Yeah, you were talking about hundreds of thousands of pages. You weren't talking about, the internet of today. But I think that said, my instinct is we might be heading back there because all the AI slop and search engine optimization, which has really wrecked the modern web, mm-hmm. there is almost a case for going back to human curated good pages.
I suppose, yes, like the Wirecutter would be the place to go if you want to buy something. It used to be that you could go to the Wirecutter, and if they had a recommendation, you just buy it and it'll be fine.
Yeah.
Blogs would be something else, internet forums. But blogs and internet forums are kind of nerdy again, whereas they were mainstream for a while, and now they're things that, everyone's on social media, which is not indexed properly either. Facebook is impossible to look at unless you're logged into Facebook, and Twitter's going the same way.
They do present a view of it to search engines, but not to us mere humans.
No, exactly. You can see it in search, but then if you click on it, you can't read it.
Yeah. Even Apple took a stab at this directory thing. Do you remember what that was? iReview.
iReview.
Do you remember iReview?
I don't remember that. When was that?
So this is in the early aughts when Apple introduced iTools. They created a service called iReview where you could review websites and you could submit your website to Apple. And they created a directory of user reviews of websites. I found it amazing to think that Apple did that. It only lasted for a year, and I think no one really used it, so they scrapped it. Yeah, I just thought an interesting aside there. But all of that is indicative of the fact that back then search was hard. It wasn't always great, and people did try other methods of finding stuff. So for the first 8 years of the Mac OS's life, there was no ability to find files. You just had to make sure that you put your files in the right folders. It was down to the user to not lose things. It was only with System 7, which launched in 1991, that the find command was added to the Finder. But this was very rudimentary. The original find command, you had to type in the exact name of the file. That was much improved in 1994 with a utility called find file, which enabled you to specify file types, creation date, and use those Boolean operators like and or that we were talking about before. But you couldn't just type in and or as natural language. You have multiple fields. It's like, I need this or this. Mm-hmm. It was complicated and fiddly to use. Being a Mac user back in that day, to be honest, I rarely used find file for that reason. You just had to make sure that you saved your files in the right place, because if you didn't, they were gone, and that's all there was to it.
I'd still get to my files that way. I just know where they are.
That's a generational thing. People of our generation are very meticulous in creating files and folder structures and meticulously storing things in the right place.
I wrote an article a year or two back now about how people don't use folders anymore. So like students in university a beginning of their course, like computer science, when you're programming, you have to keep stuff in folders. You have to have folder hierarchies and you need to understand them.
Yeah.
And they have to begin the teaching with a module on that, how it works. Sort of makes sense. You've only used computers with search. You open up Google Docs and the thing you've just used is right there. And if it's not, you just search for it and find it. You don't necessarily keep things in folders.
I think all of this paints a picture of the fact that today, when you search for files on your Mac, you're almost certainly going to find the file that you're looking for. But that absolutely was not the case in the 90s. Search was very cutting edge and not always very good. Brilliant engineers were figuring out all this stuff back in the 90s. The things that we use today without considering, that was all being invented around this time. A guy called Larry Tesler, no relation to either of the Teslas we might think about today, but a guy called Larry Tesler was running the Advanced Technology Group at Apple. Do you know anything about the Advanced Technology Group, Charlie?
I guess it's a group within Apple that deals with advanced technology.
Oh, you're exactly right. It was actually disbanded by Steve Jobs when he returned in 1997. I don't think because Steve Jobs didn't like it, but I think just because he felt that Apple at that point couldn't afford it, they were going bust. But the Advanced Technology Group was really doing pure research, and it came up with some really, really good stuff. A lot of the things the Advanced Technology Group worked on did later become products, like, for example, HyperCard and QuickTime. And so it was a very important team within Apple, and it was run by this guy, Larry Tesler. He was a Stanford grad. He went on to work at Xerox PARC. And he was one of the people that presented the graphical user interface to Steve Jobs in his legendary visit to Xerox PARC. And Jobs was very impressed by Larry Tesler and poached him to join the Apple team. So Larry Tesler, an absolute genius. He's credited with inventing copy and paste.
Oh, wow.
He worked on the Lisa project with Steve Jobs, which was the precursor to the Mac. So, yeah, the guy was a genius. He was running the Advanced Technology Group, and they were coming up with a lot of good stuff. And one of the things they came up with was a product called Apple Search, written all one word with a capital A and a capital S, which was really cutting-edge search tech for its time. It supported natural language search, and it supported stemming as well. Do you know about stemming, Charlie?
Is stemming like a word, like the word stemming, for example? If you typed in STEM, I guess a separate term, but they go up to make the final term.
Exactly, yeah. So, I mean, the word stemming, stemmed, stemmer, all these different variants in English, you know, the different like word stems. Apple Search was able to understand that they were all variants of the same word. So in that sense, it was really just what macOS needed, but it was a complete commercial flop. Can you guess how much Apple charged for Apple Search?
I don't know, $99? More than that, no.
$1,799 for a 5-seat license.
I knew it had to end with a 9.
So, just a little bit of change from $2,000. And this was for a 5-seat client-server license. So Apple Search was actually like a B2B product. Then Apple Search could index the server, and then you would have a client application running on your Mac. You could do the search and then find things on the server.
Right.
The market for that was very, very limited. So what you had was a brilliant technology, but it was an absolute commercial flop. But this was exactly the kind of thing that Steve Jobs, when he came back in 1997, looked at and thought, oh, hey, we could do something smart with that. And that's really, I think, more than anything, what Steve Jobs did that was brilliant around this time, was to work out what bits they could use to create macOS 8. And we actually did an episode on macOS 8 that, if you're interested, I would really recommend going back and listening to. So that's what he did, Apple Search. He took those bits and he used them to create Sherlock. Now, Charlie, I can send you a picture of the original Sherlock. So what do you see there? Describe Sherlock to us, the original Sherlock.
Oh, look at that. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. This is a grayscale window, like, you know, old school Mac.
Oh, you say old school. It is platinum, so it's got that nice 3D look to it.
I mean, it does look nice, but it's nothing like you'd see today. It's, you know, it's very grey, very flat.
Yeah.
And it has 3 tabs in it.
I mean, it's a very basic search, but those 3 tabs, we've got Find File, which is what search was always called on the Mac. And the other 2 tabs, what are they?
Find by content and search internet. So that's everything you could possibly want to search all in one window.
I think that's the idea, yeah. Of course, you don't really want to have to choose, do I want to search the file name or do I want to search the content of the files? You just want to find the file, right? So you actually want to search both.
What happens if you click on more choices? Do you know?
You can have multiple Boolean queries together. So there, if you've got like name contains, more choices would add another row exactly like that one, but you could change name to something like creation date.
Yeah, or file kind, for like a PDF or a...
Yeah, exactly. It is powerful, but it's not useful. I think the kind of people that lose files are not the kind of people that have the patience to construct a really complicated search query like this.
Yeah, that's a good point. I use the same thing in a Finder. When you type a search into the search bar at the top of any Finder window,
yeah.
I mean, it does a fairly decent job of just guessing what you want, but you can also make a complex query like this. And then you can save it as a smart search, which is handy.
Yeah.
I usually do that for very old things that I know I have somewhere. It's like, but where did I put that? Where would I have kept that? I either know exactly where something is or I use an advanced search.
It was a big step forward. This was the introduction of indexing, taking the index from Apple Search and putting it into search on the desktop, and you could search within files. And it worked reasonably well. And it had a plugin structure. So application developers, if you're Microsoft, you could create plugins for your file types. One of the issues here, and this is similar to the web, is if you do a search in a file, you want to see the words that are in the file, but there's actually other text there, which is the code. And if you've ever opened a Word document in a text editor, you'll see that there's all this XML code. So Sherlock needed application developers to add these plugins. So when you install an app on your Mac, then the application would give Sherlock some kind of scheme to let it know where the actual user's text is in the file. So it would know which bits to index and which bits to completely ignore.
Yeah.
And then finally, the search internet, the year that Sherlock came out, 1998, is also the year that Google was founded. So Google didn't exist as a search engine then. You would go to one of these many smaller search engines, and then their web page would be like a portal page. It wouldn't be nice and simple like Google, like just a white page with a search box in the middle. It would be pushing all these different kind of content to you. So the search box would be surrounded by all kinds of columns of crud that looked like a newspaper front page. And you would do your search there. The reason that I explain that is because I think the idea of doing an internet search within Sherlock today might seem a little bit strange. The way that it now works, I think most people just type the search term into the address field of their web browser.
Yeah.
So you don't need to go via the homepage of the search engine. The way that you could think about this is an early version of that, because back then you could not type a search query into the address field. You could only type web addresses.
Yeah.
What happened when you do a search in Sherlock, an internet search, is the search results would appear within Sherlock as hyperlinks, and you click on one of those and then it would launch a web browser. And the other thing that it could do, again, because there were multiple search engines and none of them were very good, is it could search across multiple search engines. So it could get search results from Excite and Lycos and AltaVista, and it would rank them in order of relevance. I would say, I don't think it was a brilliant feature, but there was a reason for it, if you understand the context of what the internet was like back then.
I think it was great. I mean, it was a way of finding out things on the internet without having to go to one of these terrible search engines. Whenever I had to use one of these other search engines that wasn't Google, it would always strike me how difficult it was to see the results. Saying that, that's how Google is these days. So we could probably do with the Sherlock again.
We probably could. Pin that, because I think we might come back to that discussion in a bit. If you want to know what the media thought of Sherlock when it came out, I'm going to send you a little quote here to read, Charlie. This is from David Pogue, writing for Macworld.
Oh, David Pogue. One new feature in particular will hit you right between the eyes. Sherlock, the new Find application which combines internet search engines with a searching engine for your own hard drive.
Hit you right between the eyes. David Poe was really excited about this.
He was always excited about everything, though. He was excitable.
Well, that's true, and he was an Apple fanboy before the term even existed. It seems like quite a dry topic now, but when Sherlock was added in macOS 8.5, there was a lot of excitement. Just calling it Sherlock was a step change for Apple, because before then, all the features of the Mac had self-explanatory names, so find file, for example. A Sherlock they'd branded this feature. And that's something which then carried on for most of the Steve Jobs era. Steve Jobs wanted to say, hey, look at this, we've got new stuff. He didn't want these features of the Mac to seem like commodities. He wanted to make a big song and dance about them, so he wanted to give them special names.
Also worth mentioning here is the icon for Sherlock, which is a deerstalker hat, like a Sherlock Holmes hat with a magnifying glass overlaid on it.
Well, that's a great way of segueing us to Sherlock 2, because Sherlock actually just had a magnifying glass. Sherlock 2 shipped with the Mac OS 9 a couple of years later and introduced the concept of channels. And I have got a bit of marketing spiel for you to read, Charlie, that came from the Apple website.
With many of the internet's most powerful sites included, Sherlock 2 knows lots of information. Fortunately, a new interface makes sifting through all that data a piece of cake. Simply choose a channel and type your request into the stylish window. A single click sends Sherlock into action using multiple search engines to scour the internet for the information you need. In a flash, neatly formatted results come streaming into your window, ranked by relevance. Name or site, whichever you prefer. Searching on the internet has never been easier, faster, or more elegant. In a flash.
In a flash, stylish window. Wow, their copy used to be so cheesy.
Yeah, it is quite cheesy.
I found that very interesting, just the really corny language that they used and the way in which things that we take for granted today, they made a big thing of. And Charlie, you've actually just shared with me in the chat a picture of Sherlock 2. Do you want to describe what we're seeing there?
Yeah, so it's a brushed metal window with rounded corners.
Shall we unpack the brushed metal? What is brushed metal?
Okay, well, if you take some metal, aluminium, say, or steel, and you brush it with a metal brush, you get a kind of brushed metal effect.
Well, yeah, but it is metal that is brushed. Yeah. You're doing it again. In terms of the Mac user interface, what was brushed metal? What does it mean? Why is it there?
Okay, well, it kind of looks like a sheet of metal with holes cut out of it to show you the interface, like the items inside the window. They used it with iTunes.
Yes.
QuickTime, Sherlock too.
Yeah.
And probably some others that I can't think of now.
The brushed metal user interface came about, as you said, with QuickTime. Mm-hmm. So QuickTime was the first Apple application to have brushed metal. And I think the reason it did was because it made it look like a DVD player, right? Which was like really cool tech back then. I think then in terms of the semiotics of brushed metal, it came to mean something else, which was like a very important, cool app.
Yeah.
So the apps that Apple developed that were especially important to it in some way would get the brushed metal treatment to make it feel gadgety. Something that really shocked me about Sherlock 2 when I was going back and researching this, it actually had banner ads.
Wow.
So this was one of the few examples of Apple running third-party ads within its own apps, which was kind of tacky. What was new about Sherlock 2 was that it introduced channels, and these are a row of squares that ran across the top of the Sherlock application window. And these replace the tabs from the original Sherlock. The first two are basically the same. You've got a picture of hard drive as the first channel, and that's your find file. The next channel is a picture of the globe, and that's the search internet, which is the same as before. But then we get into something very bizarre. Can you describe that next icon?
Yeah, it's like a head and shoulders picture of a woman, I think, at this size.
You know what that icon represents?
Is that people search?
Yes, people. And what's more amazing about that? Do you know what the people search was?
You could search for people and find out could you find out their contact details?
Yes.
Oh my God.
Yes.
That's a terrible idea.
Well, do you know what LDAP is?
LDAP is a server used for address book entries.
Exactly. In an enterprise environment, you can have directories where you can look up colleagues. So LDAP is used for that. But back in the day, and this is by today's standards such a terrible idea, there were public LDAP servers on the internet where you could search for people. And one of the things that blew my mind, we'll include a link to this in the show notes, when they do the demo of Sherlock 2 in a keynote, it's Phil Schiller that's doing the demo. And he searches for one of the actors in A Bug's Life, the Pixar movie. Mm-hmm. And it's like, oh, there he is. And there's his email address. And he clicks on his email address to send him an email. And I'm thinking, Phil, even back in the early aughts, that must be like a really terrible idea to do that.
I bet Steve Jobs wasn't in there. I bet you couldn't find his. Well, I guess it was steve@apple.com, but, you know.
Yeah, that would probably come up. But I found that really funny. I mean, imagine. So it actually searched a variety of different services that provided these public LDAP servers. Today, I guess you'd think about stuff like Facebook for this. But back then, it was stuff like classmates.com, Bigfoot 411, and World Pages.
And Friends Reunited?
It was that sort of thing, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that was the idea of the people search, that did the reconnect with lost contacts. There was another channel, an entertainment channel, that you could search on eOnline, Rolling Stone, and IMDb. There was a shopping channel you could search on eBay, Amazon, and even, and this really takes me back, the Virgin Megastore Online.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, a blast from the past. And news, you could search sites like CNN and ESPN. Apple was another channel, and you could search not just apple.com, but you could also search their help archive and their developer documentation. And reference, you could search stuff like Encyclopedia Britannica. In a fairly rudimentary way, depending upon the type of thing that you are searching for, the user interface of Sherlock would adapt. So, for example, if you were searching for people, then you get different columns for name and email address and stuff like that. But if you're searching for news, then you'd get website, headline. The user interface would adapt slightly based upon what type of content you're searching for. At the start, Charlie, remember I asked you about HTML? The plugin architecture for Sherlock 2, it was HTML, but you could think of it like XML. These plugins would enable Sherlock to harvest content from web pages and present them in its own custom format. We're about to get into Sherlock 3, and this is where things get hairy, because this is where the accusations of Apple plagiarizing and Sherlocking third-party developers come in. I've got a picture of Sherlock 3 to send you here.
Jolly good.
What are you seeing?
Okay, so you've still got a lot of searches along the top.
Yeah.
People is gone, apparently. Added in there are flights, stocks, there's a dictionary, there's a picture search, translation, an eBay search, and things like this.
The way that Sherlock 3 worked was the UI became substantially more customized. So, for example, if you did a search on the eBay channel, the layout of Sherlock would adjust to be optimized to show you the key components of an item on eBay. So you'd have a space for the picture and a space for the bids and a space for the description.
You wouldn't be able to do this now, because there's no way that any of these companies would let another company just pull their data out and use it without any of the Chrome around it from the website, without them being able to track what you're doing, without having to put their own links and ads.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Sherlock is not around today, not because users don't want this, but because site owners don't want this. I think in the early days, site owners like Amazon saw this as a kind of, well, why not? Because it's delivering more sales through Sherlock that we otherwise wouldn't have. And I think that was true as far as it went. But obviously, if you are the destination site, if people just go straight to Amazon, then there's no advantage in having your search results presented alongside other people's search results, because it's just encouraging people to comparison shop.
Exactly.
A great example of Sherlock 3 would be if you search for a movie, you could tell Sherlock 3 your zip code, and you could search for a movie, and it would tell you what movie theaters were running that movie. And you could click on one of the movies, and it would show you the poster of the movie, and it would show you the trailer of the movie as a QuickTime video, all within a specially designed user interface.
That sounds great.
It was great.
I would use that now.
This was one of the archetypal nice things that we can't have anymore.
Yeah, right.
That's Sherlock 3, and that would almost be the end of the story if it wasn't for a certain product from a company called Corellia Software, which in 2001 introduced a product called Watson. Charlie, tell us about Watson.
Watson was a companion to Sherlock, and apart from just being able to search on your computer or the web, it would grab weather, movies, it would search version tracker. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Which is a software update tracking site.
Yeah.
You get TV listings, price comparisons, things like this. Very similar, in fact, to what Sherlock 3 sounds like.
Yes, but also, I would say, wasn't it very similar to what Sherlock 2 sounds like?
I guess so, but just much more expanded. Okay, so the term Sherlocking is that Corellia came out with Watson. Then in the next version of Sherlock, Apple folded in much of the functionality of Watson and made Watson pointless. It meant that they were out of business, really. And then whenever Apple's done that again, it's been called Sherlocking. Now, like you say, this was an expanded version of Sherlock 2 in a way, so it's not that surprising.
Yeah.
Especially as Apple already had a product that did that. The fact that it would be expanding it shouldn't seem like a surprise. It's like, I don't know, if you had a tool that would search your Mac, before there was any search built into the Mac. You shouldn't have been surprised when Apple added search. It seems something that should obviously be included in the operating system.
I think this is even more than that, because say if Apple didn't have search in the Mac and then you created a search tool, then you've added something completely new that didn't exist on the Mac before.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that's not what Korea did with Watson. What they did was take the idea of Sherlock and run with it. So Sherlock was already an app which had channels that enabled you to bypass your web browser to search different websites and presented a tailored user interface layout based upon the type of content you were looking at. Mm-hmm. And Watson was that on steroids. They took that idea and like, well, what could we do with it? And I feel like if you do that, it shouldn't come as a surprise that the team whose idea that you took are also thinking, what could we do with it next?
I also think that being Sherlocked is not always a disaster. When Apple puts an app or feature onto the Mac, it's usually a very basic version, like the Notes app. Although the Notes app has grown much more capable, over the years, it still doesn't have as many features as dedicated Notes apps. And there's plenty of, there's people using Notion, Obsidian, all kinds of notes and writing apps, despite the fact that there's a really, really good built-in Notes app. And most people, I guess, on the iPhone use the podcast app, but there are still enough people willing to pay for podcast apps that there's, Overcast exists because it offers different features and works differently.
60% of our listeners use the Apple Podcasts app.
There you go. And what else is there? There's Overcast.
Yeah, that would be number 2 for us.
Yeah. And you could say that many of those users wouldn't be on Overcast if it wasn't for the podcast app, because that led them to discover podcasts. And then once they're into podcasts, they realized that they wanted to be able to, cut off the annoying theme tune from the end of the podcast or something like that. Which you can't do in the built-in one, but you can do an Overcast.
To me, I feel like Watson is kind of like if you jump in front of a moving truck and then you complain that you were run over, you're going to need to move faster than the truck to stay in the game.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just try and guess where Sherlock is going to go next, create that, and then sure enough, Sherlock does go there next. As you say, I think it's a good example of something like Overcast, that it does the same things that Apple does, but then it does some other things better or in a differentiated way that's meaningful to certain users. And that's a way that you can compete with Apple, but you have to keep doing that. So for example, like Apple has quite recently added transcripts, which is like a really great feature. Yeah. And I know that's getting some people to come back to Apple Podcasts because they like that feature. And so what it means is if you're like the developer of Overcast, you need to be constantly thinking about how you can add more value to continue to differentiate yourself. There's some Apple products that just languish and they never update them.
Yeah.
But then there are other products, and Sherlock was one at the time, Podcasts is as well, that does have a fair amount of focus from Apple. And so they are going to keep adding things. So I feel like if you get into the game as a third-party app developer in a territory that Apple's already working on, if you want a long-term business, you need to have a strategy for how you're going to out-innovate them. And that is absolutely possible because Apple is actually a big corporate these days. And that means that it moves somewhat slowly. So if you're a small, agile indie developer, there's the potential for you to implement features much more quickly and experiment and try things out in a way that Apple won't and can't.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I guess where sherlocking gets more problematic is where Apple actually copies something that a third-party developer has done. I don't think that Watson is the best example of that, but there have been some instances where Apple has more obviously copied something a third-party developer did and maybe implement something in a less good way, but in a good enough way to kill the original app. And so I guess that would be the argument that some people would make to say how sherlocking can be anti-user.
Did you know that the Watson website is still up?
It's interesting you found that because I had a quote from the Watson website that I wanted you to read. This is them talking about the differences between Sherlock and Watson.
Okay. It bears a great resemblance to Watson. Almost its entire capability, image search, news, stocks, movies, phone listings, eBay auctions, reference and translation, is found in Watson's toolset. And many individual tools behave remarkably like their Watson counterparts.
So I'm going to be mean and break that down. eBay auctions exist in Sherlock 2, and that was before Watson came out. News existed before Watson. Movies as a channel didn't exist, but entertainment did, which had movies within it. And phone listings existed before, and reference existed before. So if you take the 9 things that they mention, 5 of those 9 were in Sherlock before Watson came out. I mean, I don't mean to be too mean on Watson, because I totally understand how disappointed they must have been. And I should also say that Watson was a beautiful app. And I'm not the only one to recognize this. Apple did as well. In 2002, Apple gave it a design award. It won the most innovative macOS 10 category. And one of the many beautiful things about Watson was that it was built with cocoa. If you want to find out more about cocoa, you should listen to our episode on
hot drinks.
macOS 10 or hot drinks. But for lots of reasons we won't get into now, cocoa was the really good native macOS 10 environment. And when you built Cocoa apps, they had all the really nice Aqua features like drawers. Do you remember drawers?
Yep, I do. It was, you click a button and a drawer would slide out as if from underneath the main window.
Yeah.
With a drop shadow and everything.
Yeah, and it had this amazing 3D look. Mm-hmm. And so Watson used all of those native macOS 10 user interface elements so beautifully. And I think what was great about Watson was it was a very early illustration of how beautiful macOS 10 software could look when it was developed natively. And there was very little software around that did this. It was a beautiful app, and the development team lived and breathed Apple. So I totally get the heartbreak. So whilst I'm being hard on Watson from a commercial perspective, because I do think, well, what did you think would happen? I also recognize that they did great work. And I think part of their legacy is they did such a good job early on of just showing how stunningly good native macOS 10 apps could be. And in doing that, they did, I think, inspire many other developers to work on macOS 10 as well. I'm not convinced that it's true to say that Apple's Sherlock team copied them, because I think with the way in which these lead times work, I believe that the Apple team were probably already working on this stuff, thinking about this stuff. All of the premise of having channels and adapting the UI to present different content types was right there in Sherlock 2, which was shipped before Watson. So I think Watson did an absolutely fantastic job, but maybe its fate was inevitable anyway.
Corellia is still around.
And what are they doing now?
You could still download Watson and look at the Watson webpage.
I think that you need an Intel-based Mac to run it. I think you probably need an old version of macOS 10 to run it as well. The other irony here is, yes, Watson was Sherlocked, but Sherlock didn't see any further updates beyond version 3. So in 2005, when Apple shipped macOS 10 Tiger, which was 10.4, Sherlock was retired in favor of a new, much better search engine called Spotlight, which we still have to this day. And that enabled you to do a search for all the files on your Mac, and it would search both the file names and the contents of the files finally with a single search. Sherlock was still available if you wanted to use it for the internet channels, but it was no longer used for searching local files on your hard drive. In that sense, I think when we talk about this legacy of being Sherlocked, the irony is that both Sherlock and Watson were actually doomed.
Ho, ho, ho.
And actually what happened was that the developers of Watson sold the intellectual property to Sun Microsystems, and they developed a Java version of it. And so I think maybe by Sherlock 3 coming out and Watson being Sherlocked, that prompted the developers of Watson to get out just in time, because to be honest, the writing was on the wall for these kind of services anyway.
Okay, 2 things to say. One, what was the other notable aspect of macOS 10.4 Tiger?
It had the brush metal user interface.
It did, but it also, it did. It had a brush metal finder.
That's when the finder got brush metal too.
But it also had the best ever default desktop wallpaper to ever come on a Mac.
Oh, is that your favourite one?
Yeah, it's my favourite one. It's the best.
This is sort of
the blue silky kind of thing.
Yeah, I think you might be right, because I think after this desktop wallpaper, they switched to the pink stars, which I could never get into. You know, those pink nebulas.
Yeah. The other thing was, do you think if you use Infinite Mac, where you can run Mac and Next and other desktop operating systems in a browser, do you think if you ran an old version of classic Mac, you'd be able to run Sherlock still and it would actually work? I'm
interested to know if you manage to get a Sherlock to work, and if you do any of the channels still work? And does the People channel still work? Can you get Tim Cook's phone number?
That would be hilarious.
Imagine that.
No, I'd rather get Phil Schiller's phone number and then prank call him in the middle of the night.
Yeah. I guess that's something to say in terms of the legacy. What were we left with after Sherlock? And I think lots of the Sherlock ideas didn't actually die. One of the things that Tiger introduced along with Spotlight was Dashboard. And actually, if you think about it, a lot of the things that Sherlock did were also replaced by Dashboard. If you take stocks, for example, there was a stocks widget on the dashboard. So we'll do a separate episode on Dashboard. But Dashboard was the original widgets in macOS 10. And so that came along, and I think widgets then replaced lots of the other features of Sherlock. And if you remember the original iPhone when it came out, lots of those apps were actually adapted from Dashboard in terms of their design. So, for example, the original weather app on the iPhone looked like a carbon copy of the weather widget on Dashboard.
Yeah, I remember.
And the Stocks app on the iPhone looked identical to the Stocks widget on Dashboard. And if you think about it, what iPhone apps are is exactly what Sherlock always was, is a way to bypass the web. Now, people prefer to use apps for social media rather than using the web for social media. So exactly as the promise of Sherlock was that we would be able to bypass the web, that did happen in the end.
Yeah, that's true.
Sherlock morphed into Dashboard. Dashboard morphed into smartphone apps. And smartphone apps are the way now that you do an end run around the web and use something that's more of a native user interface. Another way to think about this is that back in the late 90s, search was a new technology, and Apple wanted to make a feature of it. So it bundled all of its various different search tools into a single unified search app. But as search became more of a commodity, that approach didn't make sense anymore. So instead, Apple put search boxes into individual apps where they were used. So you could search for files in the Finder, you could search for contacts in the Contacts app, and you could search for stocks in the Stocks app. Apple even established a design pattern for this in macOS 10.4, putting the search box in a consistent location in the top right-hand corner of every application window. Okay, well, Charlie, that's our episode. What did you make of it?
It was a fun run back through, it's legendary because, being Sherlock is such a thing now. So it's nice to look back at the history of it.
Yeah.
But also to remember how kind of cool Sherlock was,
I think that's right, yeah. Okay, well, I think maybe that's everything. Is there anything that you would like to add or any last thoughts, Charlie?
No, I mean, I've had my rant for the day, so I'm happy.
You're okay. Yes, it's been a ranty episode indeed. If people want to connect with you online, how can they do that?
You can find me at Mastodon, mrcharlie@indieweb.social.
Okay, and I'm on Blue Sky, Graham Bauer at bsky.social. And thank you to everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did and you're feeling particularly generous, you could head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this podcast and give us a star rating and even a review. It really helps with our discoverability on all the different podcast platforms as we're getting the show off the ground. And if you'd like to support the show even more, then you could check out our brand new merch store on TeePublic. We've got t-shirts, sweatshirts, hoodies, tote bags, mugs, and more featuring retro geek designs by yours truly. And you can access it via our brand new website, applecorepod.com. I'd like to say a quick thank you to our sound engineer and technology consultant, Martin Algerston, for making us not only sound good, but sound technically credible as well. And that's it for this time. Until next time, bye-bye.
Bye now.